The first rays of sunlight spilled over the misty mountains surrounding Willow Creek, a quiet farming village tucked deep within an isolated valley in ancient China. Every morning began the same way. Farmers walked toward their rice fields, carrying woven baskets over their shoulders. Children chased each other along the dirt paths before helping their parents with daily chores. The scent of fresh tea drifted from open windows, and the sound of running water from the nearby river blended with bird song. It was a peaceful place where life moved slowly, and most people believed nothing would ever disturb the valley they had called home for generations. Among the villagers was an elderly farmer named Liang. He was nearly 70 years old, with silver hair tied neatly behind his head, and a long white beard that rested against his faded blue robe. Years of working under the sun had bent his back and covered his hands with scars and calluses. To strangers, Liang looked like a man whose strength had long since faded. Many of the younger villagers believed he should have stopped working years ago. Whenever they saw him carrying tools to his fields before sunrise, they politely offered to help. Liang always thanked them with a warm smile, but he never accepted. Instead, he continued walking at his own steady pace, just as he had every day for more than 50 years. Most people thought Liang simply loved farming too much to retire. They had no idea that his daily routine had very little to do with growing rice. Every morning, as he walked through the valley, he quietly observed everything around him. He noticed which streams had grown stronger after heavy rain, which trees had begun to weaken with age, which hillsides were becoming unstable, and which mountain paths remained hidden beneath thick bamboo. What looked like an old man taking a peaceful walk was actually decades of careful observation. The mountains had become his lifelong teachers, and over the years, he had learned every secret they were willing to reveal. Long ago, when Liang was still a young man, his father had taken him to the highest cliff overlooking the valley. The old man had pointed toward the tiny village below, where smoke rose gently from dozens of rooftops. "Land can feed people," his father had said, "but only people can protect the land. One day, this valley will need someone who knows it better than anyone else. Promise me you'll never stop paying attention." Liang had nodded without fully understanding the meaning of those words. His father passed away only a few weeks later, but that promise remained with Liang throughout his life. While everyone else focused on harvests and seasons, he quietly studied the mountains. He learned where rainwater collected after storms, which cliffs could collapse without warning, and which forgotten trails could carry someone across the valley without ever being seen. Decade after decade, he continued learning, never imagining that the knowledge would someday become more valuable than any crop he had ever grown. Years passed peacefully. Children grew into adults, families celebrated weddings, and every autumn brought another successful harvest. Willow Creek had never known war. The village had no walls because no one believed they were necessary. Travelers rarely passed through the valley, and those who did always spoke about its beauty rather than its wealth. Life felt so secure that people stopped thinking about danger altogether. Everything changed on a cool autumn morning. Before sunrise, several hunters returned from the northern forest, much earlier than expected. Their faces had lost all color, and their horses were breathing heavily from the ride back. The entire village gathered near the central well as the oldest hunter stepped forward. "There are armed riders beyond the northern pass," he said quietly. "Not traders, not travelers. Soldiers." The cheerful conversations that usually filled the village square disappeared instantly. The village chief frowned. "How many?" "At least 50, maybe more. They're carrying weapons, supplies, and enough horses for a long journey." Fear spread through the crowd almost immediately. Mothers hurried to collect their children. Shopkeepers closed their wooden doors. The younger men began discussing how they might defend the village, even though none of them had ever fought in a real battle. The chief called an emergency meeting beneath the ancient elm tree standing at the center of Willow Creek. Every family gathered there, hoping someone would have a solution. "We cannot fight trained soldiers," one villager admitted. We should leave before they arrive, another suggested. And go where? Someone else asked. Everything we own is here. The arguments grew louder with every passing minute, until Liang quietly stepped forward from the back of the crowd. He leaned on his wooden walking stick and waited patiently for the voices to settle. I may know a way to protect the village, he said calmly. Several younger men exchanged doubtful looks. One of them sighed. Liang, we respect you, but this isn't about farming. Another added, these are armed soldiers. We need strong men, not old stories. A few people laughed awkwardly, not out of cruelty, but because fear often makes people dismiss the impossible. Liang didn't seem offended. His expression remained peaceful. I've spent my entire life walking these mountains, he replied. The valley has defenses you've simply never noticed. The chief looked at him with curiosity. What do you mean? There are paths they don't know, cliffs they won't expect, and places where the mountains themselves can become our allies. If we act wisely, we may never have to fight them at all. The crowd fell silent for a moment before another villager shook his head. Even if that's true, you're asking us to trust the plan of a 70-year-old farmer against an army. The chief hesitated. Deep down, he wanted to believe Liang, but fear clouded his judgment. We appreciate your courage, he finally said, but the risk is too great. Liang slowly nodded. I understand. Without another word, he turned and walked away. Most villagers believed the meeting had ended. They didn't realize that Liang had already made his decision. That evening, while families packed food and discussed escaping before dawn, Liang quietly entered the small storage room behind his house. He placed a hand-drawn map inside a worn leather pouch, filled a bamboo bottle with fresh water, packed a few rice cakes, a coil of rope, a lantern, and an old wooden hammer that had belonged to his father. As he stepped outside, his granddaughter May noticed the basket on his back. Grandfather, she asked softly, where are you going? Liang smiled and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. To keep a promise I made a very long time ago. May looked into his tired eyes. For the first time, she realized they weren't filled with fear. They were filled with determination. Without another word, Liang turned toward the dark mountains and disappeared into the evening mist, while the valley behind him prepared for a danger it could not yet see. Liang climbed through the mountains long before the sun rose above the horizon. The air was cold enough to sting his lungs, and the narrow trail beneath his feet had become slippery from the night's rain. Every step demanded effort. His knees ached, his shoulders felt heavy beneath the weight of his small pack, and more than once he had to stop to catch his breath. Age had slowed his body, but it had never weakened his determination. He had spent nearly 60 years walking these mountains, and although they had changed with every passing season, they still felt like an old friend whose language only he understood. Every cliff, every hidden stream, every patch of bamboo carried a memory from another chapter of his life. By the time the first sunlight reached the valley, Liang had already climbed to a rocky overlook that faced the northern pass. From there, he could finally see the strangers the hunters had described. More than 50 mounted soldiers were making their way through the forest below, their armor glinting beneath the morning sun. Supply wagons followed behind them, loaded with food, weapons, and ropes. They were disciplined, organized, and confident. Their leader rode at the front on a black horse, studying the valley ahead with the calm expression of someone who had never lost a battle. Liang remained perfectly still. Years ago, he might have believed courage meant charging toward danger. Now he understood something far more important. Courage often meant staying patient while everyone else rushed forward. He carefully unfolded the faded map his father had drawn decades earlier and studied the narrow mountain pass ahead. The soldiers were following the most direct route into Willow Creek, but they had no idea that the wooden bridge crossing the ravine had been weakened for years by insects and weather. Liang had noticed its condition long ago and had often planned to rebuild it. Now, for the first time, he realized the old bridge might save more lives by falling than by standing. He quietly climbed beneath the bridge and examined its supports. Most of the damage had already been done by nature. With his father's old hammer, he loosened a few cracked wooden pegs that barely held the structure together anymore. He wasn't building a trap. He was simply allowing time to finish what it had already started. Once he was satisfied, Liang disappeared into the trees and waited. An hour later, the soldiers reached the crossing. The first few horses stepped onto the bridge without difficulty. Their leader smiled confidently and urged the rest of the riders forward. Then, with a deep cracking sound that echoed through the valley, the ancient timbers finally gave way. The center of the bridge collapsed beneath the weight of dozens of horses. Riders shouted as animals stumbled into the shallow ravine below. The fall was frightening, but not deadly. Most of the soldiers climbed out with little more than bruises and torn clothing, yet the bridge itself had become completely unusable. The commander stared at the wreckage in disbelief. "Find another crossing," he ordered. Scouts immediately spread into the surrounding forest, searching for another route into the valley. Liang already knew where they would go. There was only one practical alternative, a steep trail winding along the eastern cliffs. It was longer, narrower, and far more dangerous, especially for horses carrying heavy supplies. Liang moved faster than anyone would have expected from a man of his age. He reached the trail long before the soldiers. Years earlier, he had noticed several enormous boulders resting against a rocky slope, held in place only by thick roots and smaller stones. During every rainy season, he wondered when they would finally break loose. Today, he gently removed a few loose rocks supporting the larger ones and then quietly climbed to safety. The enemy reached the trail shortly before sunset. Their horses moved slowly, struggling across the uneven ground. Half the column had entered the narrow passage when gravity finally took over. A single stone rolled down the hillside, striking another, then another. Within seconds, the mountainside thundered to life. Massive boulders crashed onto the trail, filling the air with dust and forcing the soldiers to retreat. No one was crushed, but the road disappeared beneath tons of rock. The commander slammed his fist against a tree in frustration. 2 routes had failed in a single day. "This valley is fighting us," one frightened soldier whispered. The commander glared at him. "Mountains don't fight." But even he sounded less certain than before. As darkness settled over the forest, the soldiers built another camp beneath the trees. Their confidence had begun to fade. Some believed bad luck had followed them into the mountains. Others quietly questioned whether the valley was worth the effort at all. Hidden high above their camp, Liang watched the fires flicker beneath the night sky. He had delayed them, but he knew the danger wasn't over. Determined armies rarely turned back after only a few setbacks. Eventually, they would discover the final route leading into Willow Creek. There was only one place left where he could stop them: the canyon known as Eagle's Gate. Few people even remembered it existed. Liang's father certainly had. As a boy, Liang had followed him there countless times. The old man had taught him that Eagle's Gate was more than a shortcut through the mountains. It was the narrowest entrance into the valley. If blocked, no army could pass without spending days clearing the path. Liang understood what he had to do. Before dawn, he began the long climb toward the canyon, carrying only his rope, his hammer, and the determination to protect the people who had unknowingly laughed at the only plan that might save them. Far below, in Willow Creek, fear continued to grow. Families packed their belongings, expecting the soldiers to arrive at any moment. The village chief ordered lookouts to watch the northern hills day and night, yet no enemy appeared. Hours became another day, and another day became 2. Confusion slowly replaced panic. Only May remained calm. Every evening she climbed the same hill overlooking the mountains, hoping to catch even the smallest glimpse of her grandfather. She never did. Still, she believed he was alive. Somehow she could feel it. She whispered into the wind, "Come home, grandfather." The wind carried her words into the mountains, and somewhere beyond the cliffs, Liang kept walking. By the 4th morning, Liang finally reached Eagle's Gate. It was exactly as he remembered from his childhood. Towering cliffs rose on both sides of the canyon, allowing only a handful of riders to pass at a time. Thick pine trees clung to the rocky slopes, their roots twisting through cracks that had widened over countless winters. Above the canyon rested several enormous boulders that had remained balanced for decades, held in place by old tree roots and loose stone. Most travelers never noticed them. Liang did. He placed his hand against the rough cliff and closed his eyes for a moment. Memories of his father returned as clearly as if they had happened yesterday. The old man had once stood beside him on this very ledge and said, "Nature is stronger than any army. A wise man never tries to conquer the mountain. He learns how to work with it." Liang had been too young to understand those words then. Standing there now, with an army marching toward his village, he finally understood every lesson his father had tried to teach him. The climb had exhausted him, but there was still work to do. He spent hours clearing loose branches, tying heavy vines around weathered tree trunks, and positioning fallen logs where they would guide the rocks instead of allowing them to scatter. Everything had to happen naturally. He wasn't trying to create destruction. He simply wanted to close the only road leading into Willow Creek without taking a single life. More than once he stopped to rest, leaning against the cold stone while his heartbeat slowed. His hands trembled from exhaustion, and every movement reminded him that he was no longer the young man who had once climbed these mountains with ease. Near midday, he heard distant voices echoing through the canyon. The soldiers had found the final route. Liang climbed onto a narrow ledge overlooking the pass and remained perfectly still. Below him, the commander studied the canyon with narrowed eyes. "This road is tight," one of the soldiers warned. "We don't have another choice," the commander replied. "Cross it quickly." The first riders entered the canyon cautiously. Horses stepped carefully over uneven rocks while supply wagons followed behind. Liang waited. Patience had always been his greatest strength. He counted silently as more soldiers entered the narrow passage. 10, 20, 30. Half the column was now inside Eagle's Gate. Liang wrapped both hands around the thick vine tied to the weathered tree above him. Taking a deep breath, he pulled with every bit of strength left in his aging body. For a moment, nothing happened. The vine stretched but refused to move. Liang gritted his teeth and pulled harder. A sharp crack echoed through the canyon. One ancient root finally gave way. A single boulder shifted, then another. Within seconds, the mountainside came alive. Massive rocks thundered down the slope, crashing onto the trail with tremendous force. Dust filled the canyon as frightened horses reared, and soldiers scrambled for safety. The commander shouted orders, but his voice disappeared beneath the roar of falling stone. When the dust finally settled, Eagle's Gate had vanished beneath an enormous wall of rock. The canyon was completely blocked. No soldier had been killed, but the road was gone. The commander stared at the collapsed pass in stunned silence. 3 different routes had failed. Days had been lost, supplies were running low, and frustration had begun turning into fear. One older soldier removed his helmet and looked toward the cliffs. "We should leave," the commander glared at him. "We came too far." Another soldier shook his head. "General, the mountain doesn't want us here." The words spread quietly through the camp that evening. Some men believed the valley was protected by spirits. Others claimed an invisible guardian was watching every move they made. Superstition began replacing confidence, and even the commander found himself staring uneasily at the silent mountains surrounding them. Hidden among the pine trees, Liang watched the campfires below. His body was completely drained. He hadn't eaten a proper meal in days, and the cold mountain air had settled deep into his bones. Still, he knew his work wasn't finished. A desperate army could become even more dangerous than a confident one. As the sun disappeared behind the western peaks, Liang climbed down toward a small spring where clear water flowed between smooth stones. While filling his bamboo bottle, he heard the sound of footsteps approaching. A young soldier emerged from the trees. Unlike the others, he wasn't carrying a weapon in his hands. His uniform was torn, his face was covered in dust, and his expression showed nothing but exhaustion. He looked no older than 20. The young man froze when he saw Liang. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Finally, the soldier lowered his head. "So, it was you." Liang remained calm. "I've been expecting someone." The young soldier looked around at the quiet forest before speaking again. "I don't understand." "You've stopped us 3 times. You could have killed many of us. But you didn't." Liang handed him the bamboo bottle. The young man hesitated before taking a drink. "My father always told me that winning by taking lives is easy," Liang said softly. "Winning without hatred is much harder." The soldier stared at the old farmer, struggling to believe the words he was hearing. "Our commander told us this village was rich," he admitted. "He said the people wouldn't resist." Liang smiled sadly. "We're just farmers. We have rice fields, children, grandparents, and families waiting for us to come home every evening." The young soldier looked toward the valley below. "My family farms too," he whispered. For the first time since leaving home, he realized the people he had been ordered to attack were no different from those he had grown up beside. He slowly handed the bamboo bottle back to Liang. "I don't think this war is worth fighting anymore." Liang nodded gently. Sometimes the bravest decision a man can make is to walk away. The young soldier stood in silence, knowing that before sunrise he would have to choose between obeying his commander or following his conscience. That single decision would determine not only the future of Willow Creek, but the future of every soldier waiting below. The young soldier returned to the camp just before dawn, but he wasn't the same man who had walked into the forest the day before. Liang's quiet words stayed with him throughout the night. He looked around at the tired faces of the other soldiers sitting beside dying campfires. Their food supplies were nearly gone. Several horses had been injured during the difficult journey, and every failed attempt to reach the valley had slowly broken the confidence that once filled the camp. They had expected an easy victory. Instead, they had found mountains that seemed determined to protect the people living beyond them. As the first light touched the trees, the commander called everyone together. "We clear the canyon today," he announced. "Once the rocks are gone, we march into the valley before sunset." No one answered. The silence was impossible to ignore. Finally, the young soldier stepped forward. "General, we've lost almost a week. Our supplies are running low and every road into the valley has been blocked. Maybe this is a sign that we should turn back." The commander's eyes narrowed. "You've become afraid." "No," the young soldier replied calmly. "I've finally started thinking." Several other soldiers exchanged uncertain glances before another veteran slowly stood beside him. "We came here expecting warriors," the older man said. "Instead, we've spent days fighting mountains." Another soldier added, "The people living there haven't attacked us once. They've only protected their home." The commander realized something had changed. It wasn't the mountains that worried him anymore. It was his own men. An army without conviction is no army at all. For a long moment he remained silent, staring toward the hidden valley beyond the cliffs. Pride urged him to continue. Experience warned him not to. Finally, he let out a long breath. "We leave." No one cheered. No one celebrated. The soldiers quietly packed their belongings, turned their horses around, and began the long journey back through the forest. For the first time since entering the mountains, there was no anger in their camp. Only relief. High above the canyon, Liang watched the long column disappear between the trees. He remained perfectly still until the last rider was gone. Only then did he allow himself to sit on the rocky ground. His body trembled from exhaustion. For nearly a week, he had survived on little food and even less sleep. Every muscle ached, and his hands were covered with fresh cuts from climbing the cliffs. Yet as he looked toward the peaceful valley below, he felt lighter than he had in years. The promise he had made to his father had finally been fulfilled. The journey home was far more difficult than the climb into the mountains. Liang's legs felt heavy, and his walking stick sank into the soft earth with every step. Several times he had to stop beside streams just to catch his breath. By the afternoon of the second day, the familiar rice fields of Willow Creek finally came into view. May was the first to see him. She had climbed her favorite hill once again, refusing to believe her grandfather was gone. When she spotted the small figure walking slowly down the mountain path, she dropped the basket she was carrying and ran as fast as she could. "Grandfather!" Her voice echoed across the valley. Liang looked up and smiled. Moments later, she wrapped her arms around him so tightly that he almost lost his balance. "I knew you'd come back," she whispered through tears. The villagers gathered one by one as Liang entered the square. At first, no one spoke. They simply stared at the old farmer they had doubted only days earlier. The village chief finally stepped forward. "The soldiers, they're gone," Liang answered quietly. The chief looked toward the mountains in disbelief. "You stopped them?" Liang shook his head with a gentle smile. "No. The mountains did. I only listened to them." For several seconds, the entire square remained silent. Then one of the young men who had laughed during the village meeting lowered his head. "I'm sorry, Liang. I judged you because of your age." Another villager stepped forward. "So did I." Soon, more voices joined in. One after another, they apologized, not because Liang demanded it, but because they finally understood how wrong they had been. Liang looked around at the people he had spent his entire life protecting. "You don't owe me an apology," he said softly. "You owe each other something far more important." The villagers listened carefully. Never believe that wisdom grows old. Strength fades. Speed disappears. But experience becomes more valuable with every passing year. Those words stayed with the people of Willow Creek long after that day. The village rebuilt the broken bridge, not because they feared another army, but because they wanted future generations to remember the story behind it. The canyon at Eagle's Gate was cleared months later, yet no one ever forgot how the mountain had once protected them. Children often asked Liang to tell the story himself, but he always laughed and changed the subject. He never wanted to be remembered as a hero. He simply wanted to be remembered as a farmer. Years later, when Liang peacefully passed away, the entire valley gathered beneath the same ancient elm tree where his advice had once been ignored. The village chief placed Liang's old walking stick beside the tree, where it remained for generations, as a reminder that true heroes don't always wear armor or carry swords. Sometimes they carry a hoe, a map, and a promise they refuse to break. Long after Liang was gone, travelers passing through Willow Creek often heard the same story from parents teaching their children. It wasn't a story about defeating an army. It was a story about one ordinary man who understood his home better than anyone else and proved that courage isn't measured by age, power, or strength. It is measured by the willingness to stand alone when everyone else has given up.